Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support is greatly appreciated. Kindly like and share this audiobook to extend its reach, enabling more individuals to access its profound wisdom. Remember to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can propagate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, nurturing a community focused on enlightenment and inner serenity. We thank you for being a part of our mission to make these transformative teachings accessible to all. Let's commence today's reading. Recollection of Hell. February 9, 2010. We're sitting here fabricating, putting together a sense of the body, putting together feelings, perceptions, more fabrications, even putting together our consciousness of these things. It's something we do all the time. And the things we put together are not totally mind-made. The raw materials come from our past actions. Sometimes those materials are good and sometimes the range they offer is pretty limited. But the mind has this obsession to keep on fabricating, keep on making these things. They last for a while, and then you have to make new ones, scrounging around for whatever you can find to give rise to a sense of pleasure. We go for the pleasure, but deep down instinctively we know that it's not going to last, which is why we tend to gobble our pleasures when they come, then cast around to see what we can do either to maintain the ones we've got, or to create new ones to gobble down next. The pleasure we get out of this process is what keeps us going. And our sense of control leads to our sense of possession. That we have the ability to create these pleasures and to consume them. As long as the raw materials are good, we're doing fine. Like right now. There are many good aspects to what we've got going on around outside us. The rain may be cold, but there's something about a rainy day or rainy night that tends to focus the mind inside. All around us outside is wet, so instinctively we look inside to see what potentials we have here for security and warmth. And all of this would be okay if it weren't for the fact that it's so precarious. It depends so much on the range of materials that are available and yet that range can change so quickly and radically. This evening I was reading a piece on Germany in the early 1930s. People were saying, oh, dictatorship couldn't happen here. That was just a year before Hitler took power. And for many of the people who were saying that, things turned very bad, very quickly. The range of options open to them suddenly narrowed down horribly. So there is political change, economic change, earthquakes, storms, illness, death. Death is the most radical change because you have no idea where you'll get thrown the next time around. The ground can disappear from beneath your feet. And yet the mind keeps going with that insatiable drive for more feeding, more fabricating. That's why we get reborn or experience rebirth. We keep looking for more. We keep craving things to feed on, to cling to fabricate, to turn into the kind of food we enjoy. Yet there are times when we suddenly find ourselves in places where the options are not appetizing at all. If the uncertainty of the human realm isn't scary enough, you can think about the Buddha's descriptions of hell. All those hell beings trying to fabricate some happiness out of horrendous surroundings. What seems particularly horrible about the hell realms is that they hold out a glimmer of hope for happiness. Think of the glowing iron hell with an open door on the far side. Everybody is running through fire, their bodies aflame, to get to the door, hoping to get out. But right as they get to the door, it slams shut. Then a door opens on another wall, so they go running through the fire to get to that door, which just as they get to it also slams shut in their face. This keeps up until finally they do get through one of the doors, and it turns out that the door leads to a hell of shit. And things just get progressively worse. There are hells where the hell guardians finally pull you out with a hook. You think you've escaped. They even play nice cop and ask what you want. You say you're hungry and thirsty. Your first thought is you need to feed. So they laugh, pour molten copper into your mouth, and then throw you back in. These are some of the possible places where fabrication can lead you. This need we have to keep turning the raw materials of experience into form, feelings, perceptions, fabrications, consciousness. So it helps you realize that when things are going well, you want to fabricate a way out. Because for most of us, what do? We play around. Things get comfortable and we like to play, just fabricating for the pure joy of fabrication. This is what music and art are all about. Fabricating purely for entertainment, without realizing that the fabrications we make are a kind of karma. If we neglect the opportunity to create something good and solid out of these fabrications, in other words, creating a path that leads to something secure, then those periods of play, those periods of joy, are just little interludes. They can suddenly come crashing down. Which means that when things are going well, we have to be heedful. We've got this opening. We've got this opportunity. We want to make the best of it. Even when things aren't going well, we want to make the best of what we do have, to figure out what's the most skillful path to make out of these potentials. The Buddha says the most skillful thing we can fabricate is the Noble Eightfold Path, like we're doing right now. Focusing on the breath. That's a form, one of the elements of form. You direct your thoughts to the breath and evaluate the breath. That's a type of fabrication. You hold the perception of breath in mind, all this, so you can create a sense of feeling that's pleasant, easeful. You want to spread that throughout the body. Then you've got a consciousness that's aware of all this. The fabrication of mindfulness is trying to keep you here. That's what mindfulness is. A kind of fabrication, reminding you what to do. Alertness is also a fabrication, as is the ardency with which you try to do all of this skillfully. You're trying to turn these aggregates into factors of the path, right mindfulness and right concentration, a way out of all the potential heavens and hells to which the aggregates, these processes of fabrication, can lead you. Even the development of discernment in right view is a kind of perception. You apply the perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self to the aggregates. First, as you're sitting here trying to create a sense of ease for the breath to get the mind concentrated, anything else would count as a distraction. Whatever's a distraction, try to see it as stressful, inconstant, and not self. That helps you to wean yourself away from the attractions of playing around with those distractions. Ultimately, once the outside distractions have been dealt with, you start turning around to apply the same perceptions to the state of concentration you've got going here. You realize, here are aggregates as well. And although the stress may be subtle, it's still there. The inconstancy may be subtle, but it's still there, which means that these things are not totally under your control. They're not the ultimate happiness. As you keep that perception in mind and convince yourself of its truth, that's when the mind begins to incline toward the deathless. It perceives the deathless as a desirable goal, and that perception can help open the way to an actual experience of the deathless. Yet even then, the mind has this tendency. It likes to keep fabricating, so it can create a sense of passion around the deathless when it experiences it. That's why there are different levels of awakening. The lower levels still have a sense of passion. There is still some fabrication going on around the perception of the deathless. This is why, when the Buddha describes the contemplation of the aggregates, first there's all fabrications are inconstant. All fabrications are stressful. Then there's all dhammas are not self. The word dhamma here applies to unfabricated phenomena, like the deathless, as well. Whatever passion you fabricate for that, you have to learn how to let go of that, too. Only then can there be full awakening. So it is possible to use these aggregates as a path to a truly safe place. Some of the epithets for nibbana, haven, harbor, refuge, security emphasize its aspect as genuinely safe. Without that safety, the mind just keeps gobbling things down and trying to fabricate more. If it can't find good things to gobble down, it just stuffs horrible things inside itself. It takes whatever it can get. If it can't get good things, it takes pain and gobbles down the pain, fabricating even worse pain for itself. It gobbles down molten copper and shit. That's our tendency. We want happiness, but we take whatever potentials we've got, and we turn them into suffering, we turn them into stress. We turn them into misery, all because of our ignorance. And then we gobble them down. Only when we learn how to look directly at this process of fabrication and do it with knowledge, understanding where there's stress, what's causing the stress, what can be done to put an end to it. Only when we bring that knowledge to the process can it become a path that really does lead away from stress and suffering. Does really lead to security where there's no more potential for any more stress. When the Buddha described those hells that can open up to us if we don't reach that security, he said at the end of the description that he hadn't heard these things from other people. He'd seen them directly for himself. They're really out there. These horrendous states of suffering we can fall into. And all are. Continual obsession right here with fabricating and fabricating more and feeding more is what can lead us there if we're not careful. So now that things are going relatively well, you don't want to just fool around and play, looking for fun. You realize that there's work to be done. Remember the old story of the ant and the grasshopper. During the summer, the grasshopper just sang, and the ant kept working away. The grasshopper kept saying, "Why are you working? It's so nice out. Let's just sing." And the ant replied, "Winter is coming. Winter is coming." The grasshopper said, "Well, I'll take winter when it comes. I'd rather sing right now." Then, of course, when the winter came, the ants went underground. They had food and they survived. The grasshoppers all died of the cold. So as you're fabricating here, remember, meditation is not just an opportunity to sing and to have a good time. We've got this whole hour here, we've got whole days to meditate. We don't know how much longer these days are going to last. The world is a very precarious place. Our karma is very precarious. You have no idea what good and bad things lurk in the dark pool of your past karma. But what you do know is that you've got this opportunity right here, right now. So do your best to fabricate it into a path that really goes someplace safe, secure, a refuge where there's no lurking danger at all. Skills of the Dhamma Wheel. November 10, 2009. Every time we chant the sutta on setting the Dhamma Wheel in motion, I like to look at the Dhamma Wheel up on the wall, the one my father made years back. It's going on 13 years now. It's got 12 spokes, which symbolize one of the passages in the sutta, where the Buddha goes through the Four Noble Truths, and the 3 types of knowledge for each truth. Knowing the truth, knowing the duty appropriate to that truth, and then knowing that you've completed that duty. 4 truths, 3 levels of knowledge, 3 times 4 is 12. That's the wheel in the Dhamma Wheel. And it should form the basic frame for the way we look at our practice. It's how we should frame our attention to things. The Buddha never taught bare attention. He talked about only 2 kinds of attention: appropriate and inappropriate. When you attend to things, it's not really bare. The fact that you're noticing something, paying attention to something, means you have a purpose in mind. Even if you decide that you're going to pay attention to whatever pops up, regardless, there are still subtle choices going on. With many things happening all at once, you can't help but pay attention to one thing rather than another, and you can't help doing something about what you're paying attention to. There is a purpose, there is an intention, there is an activity that goes along with your attention. It's important, as a meditator, that you be very clear about this. Otherwise, if you think you've reached bare attention and you're told that that's a taste of awakening, a taste of the deathless, a taste of the unconditioned, you stop looking. You don't dig deeper to see, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is there an element of intention here? Is this fabricated or is it not? In one of Ajahn Mahabua's Dhamma talks, he tells you to test everything, to be willing to destroy everything that comes up, because whatever is really true and really unconditioned is not going to be touched by your efforts to destroy it. Now the word destroy here means that you learn how to take it apart, question it, see if you can figure out how it's formed, how it can be made to come and how it can be made to go. This goes for everything, including the act of attention itself. There's always going to be an element of intention in the act of attention. When the Buddha places attention in the series of conditions in dependent co-arising, It's under the category of name mixed up with contact and intention and perception and feeling, and all of these factors have fabrication underlying them. So there's a lot going on even when you think you're just giving bare attention to something. One of your tasks as a meditator is to notice that, to ferret it out, and to learn how to apply appropriate attention to what's going on. What makes it appropriate is that the perceptions related to it are framed in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the duties appropriate to those truths, or, you might say, the skills appropriate to those truths. That's because they're the activities the Buddha encourages you to apply to the different truths. Stress or suffering, he said, is something that you have to comprehend. To comprehend means to know it so thoroughly that you develop dispassion for it. We usually don't think that we're passionate for stress and suffering, but we really are. The things we generally are passionate about carry a lot of stress with them, but we just choose to ignore that fact. So an important part of the practice is to make the effort to see how these things we love, these things we are passionate about, have that side to them. That stressful, suffering side. Then we keep focusing on that stressful side until we can develop a sense of dispassion for it. The duty with regard to the cause of stress is to let it go. Letting go is also a skill. You don't just toss things out willy-nilly. You look to see. Where is the craving? Where is the ignorance that underlies that stress? As you do this, you have to learn how to discern which desires you want to hold on to for the time being, and which ones you want to let go of, because the path includes desire as part of right effort, and that's something you should develop. The path is something you want to develop until it served its function, and then you let it go. That requires discernment. The duty with regard to the cessation of stress and suffering is to realize it, to verify it, to bear witness to it, i.e. to directly experience it. In other words, you experience what it means to let go of craving, to develop dispassion for craving. This, too, is a skill. You have to learn how to watch yourself let go of a particular craving and notice that it really does take a burden off the mind. For the most part, we don't notice these things. When we drop one craving, we're quick to go to another one. In fact, that's usually why we drop the first one. We think we found something better to crave, something more interesting, something new, something intriguing. You get tired of what you've been holding on to, and so you go grabbing at something new. There's very little time to stop and notice. What is it like to let go of craving? In what way does it decrease suffering? At the same time, there are things to develop. That's the path, starting with right view and going on through right concentration. And although there is a stage at the very end of the practice where you let go of the path as well, you've got to develop it in the meantime. The purpose of looking at things in this way is to have a framework for how you're going to understand your life, and how you can use that understanding to free yourself from suffering. The Buddha wants you to drop the framework where you're looking at yourself all the time. What's me? What's mine? What I've got that I don't like? What I've got that I do like? He asks you to put those concepts aside and use these other concepts as a way of framing things, because the two frameworks have different imperatives. If there's a me that you have to shore up, that you have to look after, then it carries the imperative of figuring out how to feed this me, how to choose food for it, how to make sure you have a good store of food, and how to make sure that that store of food is going to last. These are all imperatives of getting, and getting. When the world goes well, everything is smooth, the teeth on that getting aren't too sharp or too vicious. But when things get really difficult, when resources get scarce, you've got to watch out, because the imperative to feed physically and emotionally is not always a friendly one. If that's the framework for our attention and the imperatives that we're acting on, things can get pretty nasty. So the Buddha says to look at things simply as stress, its cause, its ending, and the path of practice leading to its ending. Learn to depersonalize everything. That carries a different set of imperatives, a friendlier set of imperatives. Instead of trying to push away your sufferings, you try to understand them. When you can't understand them, you develop the path to make the mind really quiet, still, alert, until it's in a position to see the difference between the stress and the cause of stress, so you can apply the appropriate duty. It's like going into a room where there's a lot of smoke. You don't put out the smoke. You try to put out the fire that's causing the smoke. If you go around putting out the smoke, the fire just keeps churning out more and more smoke all the time, and you never come to the end of it. The same with the mind. One of our problems is we don't really understand what to do with stress. We try to abandon it, and it just won't be abandoned. The more we try to shake it off, the more firmly it sticks to us, burning us all the time. We have to work our way through the smoke to find a fire. That's what you put out. That's what you let go of. The cause of stress. So focus on learning how to distinguish these things, in the same way you have to distinguish between the kind of craving that causes stress and the kind of craving or desire that develops the skillful factors of the path. All of this requires skill. In fact, one way of translating ignorance, avidya, is lack of skill. The knowledge that replaces it, vidya, is skilled knowing, which comes from having developed the skills. Note that there is a doing and a gradual perfection, a gradual mastery, of these different imperatives. When you've got the framework firmly in mind, then when things come up, you can perceive them in terms of that framework, and that way you know what to do with them. As you keep trying to do the right duty, you get better and better at it, until you have it completely mastered. In many ways, even though it's all too often overlooked, the most essential passage in the sutta, the heart of the sutta, is the wheel. Back in the Buddha's time, that's what they would call the combining of two variables. Not a table, but a wheel. You see this in the legal texts, like the Vinaya. There would be many possible factors for an offense, so they'd run through all the various permutations around the circle to show the verdict in each possible case. In this case, there are 4 truths and 3 levels of knowledge, so the sutta just goes around the list, one by one, until it's gone through all the 12 permutations. This is why it's called the Dhamma wheel, and why we have the wheel of Dhamma with 12 spokes on our wall. It's also a convenient symbol to make you think about the circle that goes around the rim of the wheel. It's the framework for how we want to perceive things, and to understand what you've got to do once you understand. When you have an experience, you know where to put it in the framework of the 4 noble truths, so you know what to do with it. This is the kind of attention we're trying to develop. The Buddha would often say at the beginning of a Dhamma talk, "Pay careful attention." This didn't mean just to listen carefully. It also meant to bring the right framework of thought and questioning, to see how you can get the most out of what he has to say. Then you take that framework and apply it to your practice. For instance, as you're sitting here right now, where in the breath is stress? What quality of mind can you bring to the breath to alleviate that stress, to help put an end to it, to undercut the cause of stress? Even just thinking in these very basic terms of how you deal with the breath is the beginning of the framework for the 4 noble truths. Then as you work with the breath, as you get more and more skilled at it, you can take the skills and turn around and start applying them to the mind, to the different events in the mind. You find that this framework will take you far. That's why the Buddha said that the most important internal quality for awakening is appropriate attention. So see if you can bring this way of looking at things to bear right here, right now, at the breath. Start getting some practice in mastering those skills. The particulars of your suffering. September 22, 2011. I once knew a journalist in Bangkok who asked me why Buddhism focuses so much on suffering. He said, "I don't have any suffering in my life. Why all the talk about suffering?" So I asked him if he had any stress in his life, and he said, "Oh yeah, lots and lots of stress." And he proceeded to tell me all the different things in his family and his work that were stressing him out. So regardless of what you call it, suffering or stress, if you're not an arahant, you're suffering from it. And it's good to recognize that everybody is suffering in the same way. There are differences in the particulars, but deep down inside everybody has that same sense of being burdened, being overcome. Pushed in ways they'd rather not be pushed, weighed down in ways they'd rather not be weighed down. As the Buddha said, when you face dukkha, suffering or stress, you have 2 reactions. One is a sense of bewilderment. Why is this happening to me? And the second is a search. Is there anyone who knows a way out from this suffering and stress? The Buddha took that sense of bewilderment very seriously. The other teachings given in his time that he criticized the most were the ones that he said leave people bewildered. Teachings that would say there's nothing you can do because you have no power of action or choice. That, he said, leaves you unprotected, leaves you bewildered. Or the teaching that your life is totally dependent on the decisions of some creator God. That, too, leaves you unprotected and bewildered. Or the teaching that everything is random, there's no pattern to why you suffer, so no matter how hard you try to figure it out, there's no pattern to be discerned. That leaves you bewildered and unprotected as well, for it leaves you with no way of making a decision as to what you should and shouldn't do to deal with your suffering. So he offered his teachings as aids both in overcoming bewilderment and in finding protection, i.e., protection from the suffering. One of the first things he has you do is try to take the personal sting out of your suffering. This is very hard for people to do. We're obsessed with the particulars of our suffering. I've noticed that people can go over and over and over again the particulars of why they're suffering and why their suffering is special. This, of course, keeps them more bound to their suffering. So it's important that you look into why you may have that feeling. What sort of special attention you want to demand or you feel you deserve. I've run into some people who develop that feeling of deserving special attention to the point where, if they're not given that special attention, they see themselves as martyrs. There's a certain enjoyment in martyrdom, but it still leaves you unprotected. It's still not a solution for suffering. You don't want to focus on the particulars. You want to focus on a different kind of detail. The universal details. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha has us develop the Brahma Viharas. Realizing that everybody is suffering and it would be better if we could all find a way to true happiness, feeling compassion for all those who are suffering and empathetic joy for those who are not. In other words, if you see that someone's better off than you are, you don't give in to feelings of jealousy or resentment. You don't want to pull them down to your level or what you perceive as your level. After all, if you really look carefully into people's hearts, you find that even people who look happy on the outside still have their suffering. It may seem minor to you, but it's still suffering. Remember, we're all looking for happiness, and many of us have found at least a measure of happiness, but it's not secure. So there's no need to feel jealousy for people who are in what seems to be a fortunate, but actually is a very insecure place. You're happy for them, but you also need to have compassion for their insecurity. Then there's equanimity, realizing that there's an awful lot going on, both in the world and in you, that your choices cannot change. There are people you would like to see happier than they are, but they're not. There are things you can't change in one way or another in your own life. You realize that other people have the same problem. There are things in their lives that they would like to change, but they can't. This is how equanimity gives rise to a sense of samvega. The realization that we're all suffering in one way or another, and in a lot of ways we can't do anything about unless we practice. To think of all the suffering in the world is not meant to get you depressed. It's meant for you to question yourself. How can I find a way out? If I can find a way out, how can I share it with others? This means that instead of looking to other people for a cure for your suffering, leading to your happiness, you want to find what you can within. This way, having looked at all the sufferings of other beings and developing a sense of goodwill for all beings, you come back to the particulars of your suffering from a different perspective. Instead of looking at what makes your suffering special or different, you want to look at it in terms of what it has in common with everyone else's. This is where the Buddha's summary of what suffering is becomes really important. It's the 5 clinging aggregates: clinging to form, clinging to feeling, clinging to perceptions, clinging to fabrications, clinging to consciousness at the senses. It sounds pretty abstract, and you may wonder where the Buddha got this particular way of dividing up the pie of your experience. Apparently, it comes from his practice of concentration. When you try to get the mind to settle down here in the present moment, the first thing you come into contact with, of course, is the body. You've got the breath coming in, going out. That's form. And you're going to encounter feelings. There'll be feelings of pleasure, feelings of pain, neither pleasure nor pain. You want to learn how to deal with those feelings in a way that allows you to settle down. This is where perception comes in. You perceive the breath not only as the air coming in and out of the lungs, but also as energy that suffuses the body. You start thinking about how that energy could be adjusted, how it could be made more comfortable, so that you have a better place to settle down. That's fabrication. Thinking about the breath and then evaluating the breath. Then there's the consciousness of all these things. So those are the components of concentration practice. And you find that as you try to bring the mind into oneness with its object, you have to learn how to isolate these particular functions of the mind, these aspects of your experience, so that you can adjust them skillfully. How do you adjust the form, i.e., the breath? Well, that requires fabrication, and it also requires perception because some perceptions get in the way of even imagining that breath energy could go down the back or out the legs, or that it could have an effect on any pains that you might feel in the body, any sense of blockage in the body. If you perceive the breath simply as air coming in and out of the lungs, then the breath is totally irrelevant, say, to the sense of blockage in your knee. But if you perceive the breath as the energy flowing through the nerves and through the blood vessels, then the question is, why is there a blockage there? How is it related to the flow of the breath? How can you get around it? How can you dissolve it away? You need to learn how to isolate your perceptions and then adjust them. You also need to learn how to isolate your feelings. There may be pains in different parts of the body, but is there pain everywhere in the body? No. Some parts of the body feel okay. And because they're simply okay, they may not demand a lot of attention, but if you learn how to give them attention and space to grow, to develop, then this sense of okayness becomes more than just okay. It becomes positively pleasant. There's a sense of fullness and refreshment that can come when you give these areas of well-being in the body some space, when you give them a chance to grow as you hover around them and protect them. So as you're getting the mind to settle down, these are the mental functions you have to pay attention to. Feeling, perception, fabrication. At the same time, you gain a different sense of your consciousness. It doesn't have to be just in one spot or scattered outside. You can suffuse the whole body with your awareness so that you're sensitive to the whole body, all at once continually. This allows the mind to settle down, so that you can drop the activity of evaluation because everything feels really fine, and you can actually become one with the breath, along with a sense of ease and fullness. Sometimes, though, the fullness gets to be too much. This is where perception comes in handy again. You can perceive a more subtle level of breath energy that's not so active, not so burdensome because the sense of rapture can get really strong. In the beginning it's really nice to have that sense of refreshment and fullness, but after a while it can get tiresome and depressive. So you can use your perception of a more subtle breath energy to tune into a different level where there's simply ease in the body. Then you use your sense of perception to let the breath stop, as you hold in mind the idea that there is an oxygen exchange at the pores of your skin. And if the mind is really, really still, the brain is using less oxygen, and the oxygen coming in through the pores is enough. So it's okay to allow the breathing to stop. This is the way the mind gets into stronger and stronger concentration. From there you can move it even to more subtle levels of concentration. When the breath energy is still, your sense of the definition of the body, the surface of the body, begins to dissolve. It's like you're sitting here with a cloud of little dots of feeling. You have the option of focusing on the dots or on the space between the dots. You realize that that space has no end, there's no boundary around it. You hold that perception in mind. That creates an even more subtle level of concentration. And so on through the different levels of absorption. It's all a matter of feeling and perception. Fabrications of different kinds fall silent as your directed thought and evaluation drop away, as the motion of the breathing drops away. It's in this way that the different aggregates separate out. You isolate them as you get the mind into concentration in the same way that someone who has to develop a physical skill has to learn how to isolate different muscles. When you're playing the piano, when you're dancing, you have to be able to isolate the different muscles in your hands and arms and legs and back, in your torso in general, so that you can move the body in precisely the way you want. It's the same way with concentration practice. You have to isolate these different functions of the mind to get the mind to settle down. Once you've isolated them, you've got the raw material for understanding why there's suffering, because the Buddha said that suffering is clinging to these aggregates. You've got hands-on experience with all these fabrications. In fact, one of the most important insights in all of this is to see how all of these different aggregates are fabricated. There's an intentional element in each, even in your experience of the form of the body. For instance, you have hands all the time, but you're conscious of them only when you think of using them, when you feel the need to use them. Otherwise, the perception of the hands gets blurred. The same with the other parts of the body. There's an intentional element in your experience of all these things. So look into that intentional element, that element of fabrication, to see where any clinging is lurking in there. By looking at your experience in this way, you're getting yourself out of the narratives, all the particular, personal details of your particular sufferings, the details that distract you from actually learning how to put an end to the suffering. Instead, you turn your attention to the details that help you get out. Exactly how is perception contributing to your suffering? How is feeling? How is fabrication, form, consciousness? What does it mean to cling to these things? The Buddha defines clinging as passion and delight, and it can come in 4 ways. Through sensual obsessions, through views, through habits and practices, and through ideas of what your identity is. Those are the ways in which we cling, in which we take passion and delight in these aggregates. As we do this, we're moving into some very delicate details here, but they're details of a different sort. They're not so personal in the sense of your particular narrative of your particular sufferings, but they are personal in the sense that they're intimate. They're happening right in your own mind. By looking at the intimate details that all forms of suffering have in common, you open the possibility of freeing yourself. So wherever you find yourself caught up in the details of why you're suffering or why you're feeling that nobody loves you, nobody cares for you, nobody's really helping you with your sufferings, or why you're oppressed by a particular aspect of your life, remember, everybody's suffering in one way or another. Obsessing about those particular details is not going to get you out. But if you turn around and look at the universal details, that opens the possibility to freedom. Learn to acquaint yourself with these aggregates in action as you get the mind to settle down, because they provide the key for understanding how you can do more than just settle down. You can make your escape. Isolating the aggregates. July 20, 2011. As the Buddha says, one of the rewards of concentration is that you get to understand the aggregates. What's form, what's feeling, perception, fabrication, consciousness. You get to watch how they arise, you get to watch how they pass away. When you see them clearly, you can begin to see where you're clinging to them, and how the clinging involves suffering. Only when you can pinpoint these things can you begin to let go. It's like having a room full of piles of stuff. Only when you sort things out can you begin to see which things have to be thrown away and which things should be kept. One of the reasons why concentration helps this sorting out process is that you can see things clearly only when the mind is really still. But another reason is that you actually get hands-on practice in manipulating these things in the course of getting the mind to settle down in concentration. It's in the course of that hands-on practice that you can begin sorting them out. It's like learning a physical skill, playing a musical instrument or dancing or learning a sport. You have to isolate your sense of the muscles you're using if you want to master the skill. If the skill involves jumping and you haven't been able to isolate the different muscles in your legs and the other parts of the body that you're going to employ, the jump is going to be clumsy. But as you get your own sense from within of which muscles are needed to make the jump graceful or make it go far or high, then you perform a lot better. It's the same way with the meditation. We start out trying to focus on the breath, And we put a lot of pressure on it, for fear that if we don't, the mind's going to slip away. Of course, a lot of the pressure on the breath has an effect on the circulation of fluids and energies in the body. You can create a lot of tension, a lot of tightness, a lot of discomfort doing it that way. And even all that tension and tightness doesn't prevent you from slipping off, because there's more to concentration than just pressure. You've got all these other mental activities going on that you have to learn how to master as well. Pressure on its own isn't going to bring everything to stillness. You need to understand your raw materials. To deal effectively with the breath, you have to get a better understanding of how you're sensing the body from within. This means looking at it in terms of the properties that make up the aggregate of form: earth, water, wind, and fire, along with space and consciousness or awareness. Ordinarily, when you breathe in, there's a feeling of pressure that you spread through the body. So when we say to spread your awareness through the body or to spread the breath through the body, your immediate reaction is to spread pressure through the body, but that's not going to get good results. In fact, it can create problems. You have to learn to separate these things out. Which sensations are the breath sensations that flow through the body without disturbing anything else at all, without exerting any pressure at all? If there's pressure, it's an affair of the breath element pushing the water element against the earth element. So you have to separate those out, so that you're spreading only the breath. As for awareness, that's not something physical, so why should your awareness create pressure in the different parts of the body? Again, you have to learn how to spread your awareness without pushing the other properties at all. When you can start to separate these things out, it gets a lot easier to settle down and stay with the breath, realizing that the breath energy doesn't have to be penned in by anything, doesn't have to exert pressure on anything. It can flow smoothly, lightly, all through the body, instantaneously. You don't have to drag it through during the in-breath. You don't have to squeeze it back out with the out-breath. Some people say I try to breathe down through the body through the in-breath, and I only get as far as the neck or only as far as the middle of the back before I have to start breathing out. Well, that's a misconception of the breath. You've probably been pushing some blood down there without realizing it, because there's an aspect to the breath that, as soon as you're aware that you've begun to breathe in, has already gone throughout the whole body. When you can learn how to detect that, it gets a lot easier to follow, to stay with the breath. The same with feelings. We talk about giving rise to a feeling of pleasure with the breath, pleasure with the concentration. Where does it come from? You can't push pleasure into the body. You have to realize that there are lots of little centers in the body, little sensation centers, and all you have to do is give them a little bit of space, and then a feeling of what seems like neutrality to begin with will actually become pleasurable if you give it space, if you're not pushing and pulling it around too much. Then the more consistently you can maintain that sense of space, the greater the pleasure grows. And you let it spread without pressure. It becomes rapture. A sense of refreshment, fullness. Sometimes it can get so intense that you feel like you're drowning. You're not. It's simply the fact that you're allowing these sensations to move through the body, and the movement of the breath is not disturbing them. It's giving them space. This means that sensations that you used to associate with the in and out breath are not happening. Now, some spot inside your mind may be setting up alarm signals, but you have to reassure it that everything is all right. The breath is still moving, it's still coming in, going out, but your old forced ways of breathing are not happening. When you learn that it was forced and unnecessary, you find that you can breathe in and out with a much greater feeling of rapture, fullness, and pleasure. It becomes something you can tap into at any time. As you learn how to dissociate the breath from the pressure, dissociate your awareness from the pressure, you begin to see that what was holding you back from settling in properly was your original perception of the breath. Now that you've changed that perception, the new perception is what's helping to hold you comfortably in place. There's a mental label that just says breath, and there's a picture that goes along with the label. And as you've learned, some pictures about the breath are more conducive to concentration than others. So ask yourself, How do you conceive this process of breathing in the body? Can you readjust your perception, readjust your label, readjust your little mental picture in there to make it even more useful? This is when Ajahn Lee advises you to think of all the pores in your skin opening up. When you focus really clearly and distinctly on that perception of the pores opening up, they really do open up. This is one of the ways in which the brain communicates with itself, communicates with the body. Through these images. So bit by bit you're beginning to isolate out the act of perception, as you find perceptions that are more and more conducive to settling down. What the Buddha calls calming mental fabrications. That brings us to the aggregate of fabrication itself. These are the questions you ask yourself about the breath. Your intention to stay here is also a fabrication. Your intention to change the breath is a fabrication. The way you evaluate how things are going. That's a fabrication as well. The more clearly you can isolate these functions, the more skillfully you can do them. And then there's consciousness, which is the awareness of all these things. Consciousness comes in different types. There's focused consciousness that spotlights specific sensations and mental activities, and then there's a background awareness that's already there throughout the body. When we talk about spreading your awareness, it's primarily a question of letting your spotlight concentration get in touch with the awareness already filling the body. This background awareness doesn't have to exert any pressure on anything at all. You learn how to separate this consciousness from, say, the earth and the water and the other things in the physical side of the body that you may have been confusing it with. The more clearly you can isolate these things, the easier it is to figure out exactly what's going wrong when the mind is not settling down. You get more sensitive to any feelings, perceptions, or fabrications that might disturb your concentration. You get a better sense of how to handle those as well. In particular, you get more sensitive to that little process where there's a stirring somewhere in the body which could either be physical or mental to begin with. But then you decide it's going to be a thought, so you place the label of this as a thought about X, and then you allow it to grow in that particular direction. When the mind is really still, you can see this as it's happening. You can see it more clearly because you're intent on not allowing it to take over your concentration. So it's through your mastery of these different processes of the aggregates that you can actually get the mind to settle down, which is why when the mind has settled down, you can see these processes even more clearly and are ready to evaluate them for what they are. You can see things in these terms because you've had direct experience in separating them out in the process of getting the mind to settle down to begin with. It's worth noting that the 5 aggregates are not among the teachings the Buddha picked up from other schools of thought that were taught by his contemporaries. The terms for form, feeling, and so on were already current in his time, but the idea of grouping them together as a set was original with him. And it's very directly related to the mastery of right concentration. Ajahn Lee points this out. He says that when you're dealing with the breath, you're dealing with form. As the form begins to get more and more subtle until the breath stops, the mind begins to focus on space. The ease that comes with that feeling of space, part of the aggregate of feeling. Then it goes to consciousness. That's the aggregate of consciousness. Then there's nothingness, and you begin to recognize that the sense of there's nothing is a fabrication. Then there's the state of neither perception nor non-perception, which allows you to see how attenuated perception can be. There's an image that Ajahn Lee uses in another context, but it applies here as well. Think of a rock containing different minerals. As you apply effort to your concentration, it's like applying heat to the rock. When you hit the melting point for, say, tin or lead or silver or gold, each of those metals in the rock will flow out and separate on its own. You don't have to go sorting through the rock with a pick, saying, this is a little bit of gold, and this is a little bit of silver. They naturally separate out as you apply the heat. In the same way, the activities of the aggregates all separate out as you get deeper and deeper into the formless stages of concentration. Now, the teachers of the Buddha's time were able to get into these stages, but he seems to have been the first to realize how useful it was to take these terms, the ability to separate out these processes, and run with them further. This is why, when you've been practicing concentration and you're beginning to look at the issue of suffering, you begin to see more clearly how clinging to these 5 aggregates is what brings suffering about. You're clinging to any one of these 5 activities or any combination of them because they are activities. We call them aggregates, which makes them sound like a pile of gravel, but they're not. They're just different conglomerations of activities or processes. When the mind has been in concentration, you can begin to see, this is where there's stress around aging, illness, death, birth, or wherever else the mind feels stress. The stress is there because you've been clinging to these different activities. This means that you shift your focus away from the aging or whatever, and direct it toward watching these activities in action, the same activities you've been engaging in to get the mind to settle down. The more clearly you can see these activities and their direct connection to suffering and stress, then the easier it is to let them go. So when you find yourself running up against problems in the meditation, a sense of discomfort in the body or some sloppiness in maintaining your focus, ask yourself, which of these activities have you not been able to isolate out? Which ones are you confusing or glumming together in an unskillful way? The more easily you can isolate them out, then the more efficient your concentration is going to be, the more solid it's going to be, and the better it's going to be as a foundation for gaining even deeper insights. The limits of control. August 19, 2009. They say they've found that when they stimulate a certain part of your brain, you can feel a very strong sense of oneness. Your sense of boundary between yourself and the world outside dissolves. There's a very satisfying sense that you're one with everything you're aware of. Of course, this doesn't mean you really are one. The brain is just sending that signal. The question is, what use is that perception? If you're feeling one with things, can you change them to be better? Can you exert control over them? And even though there may be a sense of well-being that comes with that oneness, how lasting is it? The Buddha himself pointed out that the highest sense of oneness is the sense of consciousness being totally one and single, when everything in the range of your consciousness becomes one. But, he said, even in that sense of oneness, there is inconstancy. There is stress. It's not totally under your control. He also said that the idea that you are one with the world, or you're one with the cosmos, is the most ridiculous self-view there is. After all, if you are one with something, or it really is you, you should be able to control it, get it to do what you want. All you have to do is think, and there it goes. It changes in line with the thought. And if something is you, then it's also going to be yours. If you're at one with everything, then the piece of land next to ours is yours. The cars in the parking lot are yours. Everything that comes along should be yours. But it's not. Try to go and exert your ownership over land or the cars, and a lot of people will fight you off. So the sense of oneness may be a nice state of concentration, a very relaxing sense of well-being, but beyond that, it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have any truth value, and it's certainly not the end of suffering. A more useful way of looking at your sense of self is looking at where you do exert control. Ajahn Suwat once made a comparison between 2 of the passages we chant here regularly. On the one hand, there's the passage we chanted just now. Anabhisaro. There is no one in charge. Asako Loko, the world has nothing of its own, which means there is nothing of your own either, nothing worthy of calling you yours. But we also have another chant, Kamasakamhi, I'm the owner of my actions. Your actions are yours. As Ajahn Suwat said, think about that. There's a very useful teaching in that paradox. We do have the power to exert control over our intentions right now. And our intentions do shape our experience of the world around us, the world inside us, at least to some extent. Enough to make the difference between suffering and not suffering. What we're experiencing right now is the result of past intentions, plus our current intentions, plus the results of our current intentions. Even though we may not have absolute control over things, and will ultimately have to let them all go, we do have some control over our actions now. And you want to make the most of that fact. You want to be able to fabricate a path to the end of suffering out of your intentions, while you have the ability to do so, Because ultimately there comes a point where you have to let go of everything here and go on to who knows where. So what we are doing as we're meditating is to find out exactly how much control we can exert over form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. This is the point of all the aspects of the practice. Generosity, for instance. One of your first experiences of freedom is when you have something that's yours, but you decide you want to give it away, not because you have to or you're expected to, but simply because you want to share it with someone else. That's your first sense that you're not totally a slave to your desires, totally a slave to your greed. You're free to say no to them, and a higher pleasure comes as a result. This is a very skillful way to exercise control. The same with the precepts. You can say no to your desire to harm someone else, no to your desire to harm yourself, no even to actions that seem pleasant in the short term, but in the long term cause harm. Then there's the useful sense of control, the skillful sense of control, when you're practicing concentration. You're taking those 5 aggregates and basically pushing against what they call the 3 characteristics. Push against anicum, see how constant you can make your mind. Push against dukkam. See what sense of pleasure you can create out of your sense of the body, out of your present awareness. Push against anatta. How much can you control the mind to stay with the object of your concentration? Push against the envelope. You find that you can create a sense of greater constancy than you have in any other way, a greater pleasure than you've experienced for many other things, greater control over your mind. This is not only to give the mind a pleasant dwelling place, but also to develop more mindfulness and more discernment. It's easier to be mindful when your sense of the breath in the body feels really good. It's easier to stay with it for long periods of time. So you want to take advantage of that. It's easier to see things clearly when everything in the mind is very still. Like the water in a lake. If the water is still, you can see clearly what's in the bottom of the lake. If it's stirred up by the wind, if there's too much movement on the surface, if there's a strong current in the lake that gets it muddied, then, even though there may be the same stones and everything else that's under the water when it's clear, you can't see them through the water. But if you allow the mind to settle down and be still, things become a lot clearer. You can see the subtle movements of the mind. Where its movements cause stress, where they don't cause stress, or at least where they reduce the amount of stress you've been experiencing. So in this practice, we are pushing against those characteristics of inconstancy, stress, and not self, all for a good purpose. It allows us to gain the wisdom that ultimately goes beyond them. As I was saying last night, you do develop a healthy sense of self as you pursue the practice. You do get a greater sense of control, but you have to make sure it stays healthy. Avoid the unhealthy senses of self that can develop around the practice. As the Buddha says, don't go comparing yourself, saying, my practice is better than other people's practice. Or, I'm a better person than they are because my practice is better than theirs. That's not helpful at all. What is helpful is that you begin to gain a healthier sense of well-being, a greater insight into what's going on in the mind, by pushing it in the direction of concentration. Ultimately you find that things push back. The mind can be made only so constant through concentration. After all, the element of intention that keeps it going is something you have to keep fabricating again and again and again. And even though it's relatively useful, there's still an element of stress simply in that fact. That's when you run up against the limits of how far you can control these things. But if you hadn't been trying to exert that control, you wouldn't see exactly where the line between controllable and uncontrollable lies. And you wouldn't see the subtleties of the stress that very refined control contains. This is one way you can induce a sense of dispassion, disenchantment. That no matter how good it gets, and this is as good as it gets, in terms of fabricating a sense of well-being, it's still not totally sure. It's still not totally solid or constant. Now, some people might give up at this point and say, if this is as good as it gets, I have to satisfy myself here. But the Buddha was not that kind of person. He had tried to see if there is some way to touch the unconditioned, and he found that there was, by developing these things as far as they can go, and then letting them go. Think of the old image of climbing up the top of the pole and letting go. You find that you don't fall because you've let go not only of the pole, but also of gravity. You've let go of time and space. That's something you can't control, but it doesn't matter at that point because it doesn't need to be controlled. It doesn't need to be fashioned. You don't have to keep working at it. It has nothing to do with parts of the brain being stimulated or not being stimulated. It lies outside of that dimension. And although you might say there's a oneness, it's a different kind of oneness. It's not based on perception, it's based on total unlimitedness. So as you work at the practice here, try to be very clear about where your sense of control is. That's where your sense of self is going to be found, to the extent that you're creating a self. If it's a self based around the skills you develop in the practice, it's actually useful. It's not sentimental. It's not based on some abstract idea. It's based on your skill level, so you want to expand your skills so they can lead you to greater happiness, and finally to the point where you don't need those skills anymore. That's when the whole issue of control gets set aside. The whole issue of self and not self gets set aside. But you get there by exploring exactly how much control you can gain over the aggregates, how much control you can gain over your actions, and by pushing them in as skillful a direction as you can. Staying, moving and neither. December 28, 2010. If you were to boil all the issues of concentration practice down to the most basic one, they'd come down to the question of when to stay in place and when to move. The next level up, when you're going to stay in place, is how do you do it? How do you get the mind to settle in? And when you move, how do you move in a way that doesn't obscure things? In other words, there are times when you simply want to stay with one object and get everything to settle down around that object, and other times when you want to question, look into something, allow some thoughts to come into the mind and see where they go, so that you can understand the processes of the mind. The same principle applies to the body. When you're sitting in meditation, there are times when pain comes up. How do you know when it's time to stay with the pain and when it's time to move? Part of the answer lies in learning how to use the breath. When you're working with the breath here, it's like doing bodywork. There are basically two kinds of bodywork. The more aggressive style tries to straighten you out right now. It pulls you here, bends you there, forces the body into a better alignment. The other style is more indirect. Just placing the body in a particular position where it will naturally release and relax into alignment, rather than being forced there. When you're working with the breath, the second approach is your primary focus. You want your posture to be straight. You want the organs of your body not to be scrunched up against one another. But if you try too hard to straighten things out, you can actually damage yourself. Remember, we're working with breath energy here. As Ajahn Fuang used to say again and again, this is the key to our skill here. And crucial part of that skill lies in learning to distinguish the breath energy from the other properties of the body and from the feelings it creates, and to work primarily with the breath. Now, the breath is subtle. Sometimes we feel that we suck it into little sacs in the body and then squeeze it back out. Well, that's air. That's not the breath. The breath is the energy flow, and it doesn't have any clear edges. There's no clearly demarcated area where this is the breath, this is not the breath. Breath energy actually suffuses everything in the body, and it can flow unimpeded, even through the solid parts. The liquid property is what gets impeded by the solid parts. But the breath can go anywhere. So when the alignment of the body doesn't seem quite right, think of this totally unbounded energy, unbounded in the sense that it has no spatial boundaries. It can go anywhere, do anything. Allow that sense of unboundedness to realign things, so that you're not pushing and pulling, because sometimes the pushing and pulling can do damage. Simply open and allow, and once you're there with that kind of energy, it's a lot easier for the mind to settle down in a way that doesn't require a lot of effort, a lot of exertion. This is one of the problems with reading the texts too much. We get a lot of preconceived ideas of what the mind should be doing, what phases it should be going through. Then we try to squeeze it into those phases. You can squeeze it in for a while, but after a while you run out of energy. And if you think of anything that's been squeezed into a confining place, you realize it can get all distorted, which is not what you want. You work on the causes and let the effects take care of themselves. In terms of the concentration, the causes are three. You direct your thoughts to the breath, you evaluate the breath, and you try to stay with the breath as your single preoccupation. That's all you have to worry about. There are times when you'll find that your conception of the breath gets confused, as in the tendency to confuse the breath energy with the liquid energy in the body. When liquid runs up against obstacles, it can't go through. It gets squeezed in. It builds up pressure. But the breath doesn't have to be squeezed in. Yet when we start breathing as if it were, that creates problems. So, remember, it's totally free to go anywhere at all the time. The neat boundaries we place around it are artificial. Learn to erase them and see what happens. As for the pleasure or rapture you want, that will happen on its own. You can squeeze it, you can force it, but squeezed and forced pleasure is not going to last very long. It's like squeezing a piece of fruit to make it ripe. You know that ripe fruits are supposed to be soft, so you squeeze your piece of fruit, squeeze it until it's soft, but that doesn't ripen it. You just get mush. The right way is to leave the fruit on the tree, water the soil, make sure there are no insects eating your fruit, and give the tree some fertilizer. In other words, you focus your attention on the roots, and the fruits take care of themselves. And for the time being, you don't want to go anywhere else. This is where the principle of staying comes in. We're creating a state of becoming here, a state of mind. As the Buddha said, that requires a desire, because desire is the basic seed around which everything else grows. The seed has to be located in a certain place. So we're locating things in the breath, locating things here in the body, here in the present moment. Our desire is to stay here. In doing so, we learn a lot about the process of becoming, how the mind creates these worlds by creating a world that has reference to the present, that's solidly still, and that enables us to see the other worlds as they begin to form. This allows us to see that we have the choice to go with them or not. All too often the choice is almost automatic. A thought comes up and you jump right in and right off without looking to see who's driving, where they're planning to go. And so one of the important skills in the meditation is learning how not to move along with the thoughts. A thought will shoot out, and you don't have to get involved. You stay right here with the breath. When you can make that separation, you see that the thoughts shoot out for a little ways and then just fall. Like the old legend of the Hiltrud chieftain in northern Thailand back in the 7th century. He had fallen in love with the queen who had come up from the central plains to the city of Lamphan, where she established her kingdom. He sent his emissaries to propose marriage, so she asked them, "What does your chieftain look like?" They were scrawny little hill tribesmen and they said, "Well, he looks just like us." She wasn't interested. But then the chieftain proposed through his emissaries that he would stand on his mountain, which was 30-40 miles away, and throw 3 spears. If any of the spears landed in the city, she would be his wife. If they didn't, he'd abandon his request. She figured that there was no way he was going to get the spears that far, so she agreed. So he chanted his magical charms and threw his first spear, and it almost got into the city. This was when the queen became concerned. So she created a hat for him out of her clothing. She put her own charm on it and then sent it to him. And he thought, this is a sign she has changed her mind. So he put the hat on. As he got ready to throw the next spear, he tried to do his magical chants, but they had no power. The spear just went up in the air and came right down. Didn't go anywhere at all. Most of our thoughts are like that. They have magical power because we give them the power that allows them to go miles and miles. We jump right in and we keep them going. So one of the skills we're learning here is to deprive them of their magical power, to see that they're simply constructs. If you don't jump in with them, if you're not maintaining them, they don't go very far. So the big issues in concentration are how to get the mind into position and how to keep it there, at the same time allowing it to see. This is important because there are types of concentration where you just blank out. You're still, but you're not learning anything. The whole point of this is to put you in a position where the mind is still and clear and can see things within its depths, like fish in a pool of clear water. Whatever is going to move, you can see it, but you're not moving along with it, unless you see that it is a necessary thought, something you've really got to think through. Okay, you say, we're going to move with this, we're going to go with it. And when we've finished our work with it, we'll come back here. So it's not that we shut the mind down totally and leave it there. As the Buddha said, when you gain full control over your thoughts, it means you can think when you want to think and not think when you don't. You've got the choice instead of just willy-nilly riding along with whatever comes by. You're in a position where you can see which things are worth thinking and how a lot of things are not. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha has us learn how to question our assumptions, because our assumptions are what pull us into a lot of thoughts. This is also why he teaches so much about questioning. One of the main lessons he teaches is that some questions are simply not worth answering, because the dichotomies they set up are false, either because the issue itself is just a non-issue, or because there are more alternatives than just the two. So when the Buddha talks about gaining insight through investigation, this is part of it. Learning the process of questioning. When you set up a question, how are you predetermining the answer? When you can see that, you learn how to step outside of the questions. There is that famous exchange that Ajahn Chah had when a woman in England asked him, according to one version of this story, about what happens to people who go to nirvana. Do they still exist? Do they not exist? Nobody had ever been able to answer this question to her satisfaction. He replied that neither alternative applied, and he gave the image of the candle to explain why. When the candle is burning, you can talk about the flame. What shape it has, what color it has. When it's not burning, you can't talk about its shape or color anymore. And it's the same with the person who has attained nirvana. You can't talk about whether they exist or not, because they're no longer burning. Then he asked her if that answer satisfied her, and she said, no. She wasn't satisfied with his answer. He said, in that case, I'm not satisfied with your question. Which in one way is startling, because usually the person who asks the question is the one who has the power to say, this answer satisfies me, this one doesn't. This is how the mind traps itself. It sets up questions, sets up dichotomies and makes them authoritative, and it ends up demanding answers that keep it trapped. So one of the skills you want to develop as a meditator is how not to fall into that trap. You have to question the question, to learn which questions are worth riding with, and which ones are not, because questions have a huge shaping influence on the rest of your thoughts. In other words, you get to decide which questions and which motivations for setting up the question are satisfactory, and which are not. Ultimately, it turns out that this dichotomy between moving and staying still is a false dichotomy, too. There comes a point when the mind is fully trained in learning how to stay still, and it realizes that the one issue remaining is its attachment to staying still. But you don't want to run off moving either. So you're trapped, as long as you see that those are the only alternatives. As long as you see things in terms of mind states with a location like your state of becoming, centered around that particular desire, that particular intention, then all of your choices come down to whether you're going to stay with this intention or move to another one. But when the mind is still enough and sharp enough, it comes to see that there is another alternative. This is why the Buddha said, in the dimension where suffering ends, there is no coming, there is no going, and no staying in place. When that diva asked him how he crossed the stream, he said he crossed by neither moving forward nor staying in place. He left it at that and didn't explain it because he wanted the diva to realize that there was more to the mind than what the diva had presupposed. He wanted to subdue her pride. But for us, as we're meditating, we find that this is one of the serious questions hovering over the practice as we get closer and closer to gaining real insight. What are the alternatives aside from moving and staying in place? Ajahn Lee once said we have a tendency to see the big issues as the big abstractions, all the technical vocabulary, as high-level Dhamma, whereas the simple business of learning how to keep the mind still is low-level Dhamma. But that, he said, is wrong. We've got it all backwards. Looking at the basics again and again and again. That's where the real high-level work gets done. That will enable you ultimately to see what that other alternative is. That's a lot of the practice right there. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the immense importance of sharing wisdom expansively. Presently, we've transformed this extensive 1,000-page work into a readily accessible audio format. The duty to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, benefiting numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of knowledge sharing and the cultivation of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We extend an invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can bring profound positive change to the lives of many.